Listen carefully, because this is not a story you were ever meant to hear. It begins with a butcher's hook, cold iron wrapped in dust and silence, sealed away in a locked case in a Massachusetts historical society. People walk past it every day, never asking what it touched, never wondering why it survived when everything else was erased. But behind that hook is a darkness that the city itself tried to bury, a darkness that whispers of two brothers, two shadows, who ran a butcher shop in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1870, a shop that fed no one, yet never ran out of meat. Imagine it. A narrow street, wind pushing sawdust across cobblestones, the church bells tolling over a town already weary from millwork and poverty. Before dawn, the Grady brothers' doors would open. After dusk, without notice, they would close. And in between, the ledger filled with names that were never names, only initials. A's, M's, X's, taken, always taken. But no one in town remembered ordering meat from them. Not one family admitted it. Not one tavern kept their pork on ice. No restaurant listed their beef on the menu. And yet the hooks in the back room never stayed empty. This isn't folklore. This isn't the invention of some fevered storyteller. These are fragments preserved in freight manifests, in the margins of the city directory, in the frightened notes of inspectors who did not stay long enough to finish their work. Deliveries logged and signed to addresses that had burned to the ground years before. Shipments sent to mills that had shut down, their machinery already rusting in silence. Meat going where no mouths waited, no tables waited, no families waited. The town lived with the strangeness like it lived with the river fog. Thick, unsettling, but never questioned too loudly. Because the few who asked, the few who walked down into the brothers' cellar, came back changed. Their eyes didn't look the same. Their voices caught at the wrong syllables, like the rhythm of speech had been rewritten. One man, an inspector, left his notebook on a tavern table and vanished into the night. His last words on the page, "Hooks not for flesh, hooks for holding." And then the ink trails off, as if the pen was taken from his hand mid-sentence. Why were the Grady brothers tolerated? Why was the shop allowed to operate when it sold to no one and accounted to no one? Because the town itself seemed unable to touch it. The council passed an order to inspect. The inspector resigned. The clergy moved to denounce. The clergy fell ill. A fire was planned to condemn the street. But when the fire started, the wind bent away, sparing the shop and burning the houses beside it, as if something refused to let the walls fall. You see, history leaves its scars, but it also leaves its silences. And in the silence of the Grady brothers' shop, in the silence of that cellar corridor bricked off without explanation, there is something older than Massachusetts, older than America, older even than the books of flesh and trade, something that fed on obedience, something that wore the mask of commerce but was in truth a ritual. And this is the part you were never meant to know. That hook, the one still chained in the case, was not tagged as a butcher's tool. The first curator labeled it unclaimed. Think about that word. Not butcher's hook, not artifact, not implement of trade. Unclaimed, as though whatever had held it had never belonged to this earth in the first place. But there is a deeper layer here, darker than missing ledgers and vanishing inspectors. Ask yourself, who profits when a town forgets its own memories? Who profits when men bring meat to ruins, when hooks carry weight that no eye can see? The answer is not the brothers alone. They were agents, not architects. Their trade was not with the living townspeople. It was with something else, with an economy that does not appear in books, with customers that never speak, with a hunger that never ends. What if I told you that systems of power, governments, churches, corporations, still operate on the same principle? Deliveries made to places that do not exist, resources consumed by mouths that are never seen, budgets for wars that have no enemies, programs for diseases that were never cured but carefully renamed. Just like the Grady brothers' ledger, initials in a column, marked taken. And every time you believe the story, every time you accept that the meat was eaten, you are complicit in the ritual. You were taught history is clean, wars, dates, victories, progress, but real history is meat that vanishes. Real history is the inspector who does not come back up the stairs. Real history is the corridor bricked off and left unexamined, because even the bricklayers refuse to look inside. That is why I am telling you this, because once you see the hook, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand that the brothers were not anomalies but prototypes, you begin to recognize the same structure in your own life. Look at your paycheck. How much of it disappears to initials? Look at your taxes. How much of it feeds programs that lead nowhere? Look at your digital trail. How many deliveries are made in your name to addresses you will never see? You are still inside the shop. You're still standing before the hook. The Grady brothers did not vanish. Their names dissolved, yes. Their shop condemned, but their pattern, their ledger, survived. It spread. It infected the very institutions that claimed to protect you. And if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of the cellar, the sound of iron chains shifting in the dark. Do you feel it? That unease in your chest? That tightening in your throat? That is not fear. That is recognition. You already knew somewhere deep inside that the world was not built on the stories they told you in school. You already sensed that something was feeding on your silence. And now, as I pull back the curtain, you see the shape of it. The hook, the initials, the taken. You were never meant to know this story, but you are here. And once you know, you cannot go back. Listen, I need your full attention now. The first descent left you with an image, a hook, initials, a cellar bricked over. Those images are not an ending, they are a map. In this section, I will trace the lines of that map into the systems that shaped the Grady brothers and, more importantly, the systems that still shape you. This is where history stops being comfortable and starts being a mirror. Picture the ledger again, not as paper, but as an algorithm. The columns are obedience, anonymity, and normalization. The initials are not initials. They are tokens. Tokens that authorize action. Each taken mark is a permission granted, a transaction completed between two parties who never meet in daylight. One party provides supply, the other receives benefit. No receipts, no witnesses who remember. This pattern is the smallest element of a far greater machine, a machine designed to extract compliance and convert it into power. Do not make the mistake of thinking the Grady brothers were inventors. They were technicians. They followed a blueprint older than their town. The blueprint teaches 3 lessons. First, create a service that appears essential. Second, hide the beneficiaries in plain sight. Third, punish curiosity with consequences disguised as coincidence. In Lowell, the service was meat, but the form could be any commodity: data, money, rumor, authority. The beneficiaries could be corporations, churches, secret societies, or what we call the system. Whatever label you prefer, the mechanism is always the same. Use ordinary commerce to launder the extraordinary. Now listen to this. Obedience upgrades into ritual. A town tolerates something odd because it distrusts the alternative. People say, if we ask, they'll notice us. That thought, the fear of noticing, is governance at its most effective. It keeps people small. The butcher's cellar became a theater of subtle threats. A look that lingers too long. A ledger with only initials. An inspector whose handwriting trembles in the margins. The Grady brothers never needed to shout or coerce. They only needed to ensure that silence became the path of least resistance. This is how obedience becomes a habit, and habits become institutions. You must accept that power prefers the invisible route. Loud victories are messy. Invisible control is elegant. The brothers were elegant. They made deliveries to ghost addresses because ghost addresses are untraceable. When you make a payment and the receiving account is a shell, you assume the money disappeared into complexity. But invisible routes are not random. They are planned. They're routing tables for accountability to avoid the light. Every time you see an expense line with no clear beneficiary, a miscellaneous or an administrative fee, you are looking at the modern ledger. Every time an official document uses initials, euphemisms, or redactions, you are witnessing the same ritual. And who enforces the ritual? Not soldiers. Not even bankers, necessarily. The enforcers are the little things that make you feel unsafe if you speak. A social ostracism, a professional setback, a rumor that follows you. In Lowell, it might have been a whispered threat about sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. In your life, it might be a smear job, an audit, a sudden decision to deny you a permit. The mechanism is consistent. Use small, believable inconveniences to discourage large acts of curiosity. The result, a culture that polices itself. This is why the bricked corridor is crucial both literally and symbolically. A corridor is a connection, An artery. Those bricks are not closure. They are a seal. Seals are made by people who fear exposure. Every institution that refuses inspection, every board that blocks access to records, every archive sealed by law, every meeting without minutes, is building its own bricked corridor. Think of those bricks as the institution's immune system. When you try to pry them open, you set off alarms. Not all alarms are loud. Some are legal, some social, some economic. Some are simply the slow drip of career stagnation. But alarms exist to keep the blood of curiosity out. Now ask yourself, where does your town's ledger hide in plain sight? It is in the payroll. Well, someone won't explain. It is in the donations whose source is anonymous. It is in the orders placed to firms you cannot Google. It is the data broker who sells a profile of you with no accountability. It is also inside the psychological architecture that makes you defer to titles and uniforms. If a man in a uniform tells you to look away, you look away. That's the ritual. And rituals, once repeated, harden into institutions. Institutions then produce culture, and culture refuses change because change is noisy and dangerous. But the machine is not infallible. It requires consent, not always explicit, but habitual. You can see that consent in the town's indifference to the ledger. People made excuses. We have enough to worry about. It's been that way for years. It's not my place. These are rationalizations, yes, but they are also safety valves. Every collective action problem hides behind 1,000 private comforts. Consciousness is messy and expensive. Ignorance is cheap and comfortable. The Grady brothers exploited that cost differential brilliantly. They offered convenience and demanded silence. Which would you choose if your belly was empty and your job hung on your mouth staying shut? This is why the story of the brothers is dangerous to hear, because it forces you to compute a cost you have been trained to ignore. How much of your life is conditional on your silence? I don't mean secret crimes. I mean the little compromises that keep you in line. Promotions given to those who don't ask questions. Invitations extended to those who conform. Scholarships, contracts renewed for those who obey. The ledger is full of those taken marks. You have been taught to view them as normal transactions. But what if the transaction is not between equals? What if the taken column is a tally of obedience? We are at a pivot now. The Grady brothers' operation is a microcosm, a simple case study of extraction. They ran a supply chain that bypassed accountability. Modern power structures run identical supply chains, financial, informational, social, that funnel benefit to invisible nodes. You cannot dismantle those nodes by indignation alone. You dismantle them by tracing the ledger and refusing the default path. You dismantle them by recognizing that every time you accept a mysterious fee or avert your eyes from a sealed room, you are contributing to the ecology of secrecy. So what is the remedy? What does a man do when he recognizes he is standing in a room with a hook on the wall? First, stop normalizing. Name the ledger. Verbally call out the initials. Ask for receipts. Demand that walls be opened to inspection. That is not naive. It is tactical. When enough men begin to ask the same questions, the ritual of silence becomes brittle. Power doesn't like brittle. When bricks are cracked, whoever sealed them will reveal why. Sometimes the reveal is worse than the silence. Sometimes it is cleansing. You must be willing to risk both. Second, reclaim your own ledger. Make a list of the compromises you have accepted. Be brutal. No excuses. If you cannot hold your head up because of a silent favor you accepted, then understand that the cost of silence was paid with your dignity. That ledger matters more than any paper one. Once you clear your personal accounting, you remove one cell from the system that feeds on your acquiescence. Third, and this is the hardest, practice seeing the structures behind the story. Names change, tools change, but the architecture of extraction remains. When you can see the pattern, you can anticipate the next move. The brothers used meat. The modern iteration uses anonymity and complexity, but both require the same resource, your acceptance. Withdraw it. I am not asking you to become paranoid. I am asking you to become literate. Paranoia is an inability to act. Literacy is a skill that opens options. If you learn to read ledgers, you will stop being surprised by the chain. If you learn to question why a corridor is bricked, you will stop accepting sealed rooms. This is the real danger of the Grady brothers' history. Once you see the pattern, you cannot pretend you don't. That knowledge is a responsibility. It will change your relationships, your work, your town. It will make many comfortable people uncomfortable. That is inevitable. You've walked 2 steps down the corridor already. Now the air is colder, heavier. The silence in this story is not empty, it's weighted. Every silence hides a transaction, and every transaction leaves an echo. If you listen closely, you can hear the echoes. Not just from Lowell in 1870, but from the world you live in right now. Let me ask you a question. Why do you think the Grady brothers' ledger was initials and not names? Why not Mr. Smith, Mrs. Allen? Why only a letter? Because initials erase identity while preserving record. A letter is enough to satisfy accountability, but not enough to trace. Think about that. It's the same tactic your banks use when they list Client A. The same tactic your government uses when they redact entire paragraphs, leaving only black bars and fragments of language. The same tactic secret societies have used for centuries, replacing faces with symbols, names with ciphers. The ledger was not only commerce, it was a rite of depersonalization. You are no longer a man, no longer a woman, no longer flesh and memory. You are an initial, a placeholder, a resource, a token in someone else's ritual. You feed their book. You never see their face. That is how systems strip dignity. That is how they take power without ever raising a knife. Now hold on to this. The cellar. Inspectors who descended never came back the same. Their eyes, their speech, their posture, fractured. What did they see down there? No record survives, and that is the most disturbing fact of all, but the pattern tells us enough. The cellar was not for storage, it was for initiation. When an inspector went down, he was shown something that collapsed his sense of the ordinary. He was exposed to the raw structure of power, the machinery behind the ritual, and he could not process it. This is the same method used in intelligence agencies today. Shock breaks resistance. Overwhelm the mind with what it cannot categorize, and the mind folds. It accepts a new frame because the old one cannot contain what it just witnessed. The cellar was psychological warfare before the phrase even existed. The hooks weren't for meat. The inspector wrote it himself. Hooks not for flesh, hooks for holding. Holding what? Not carcasses. Holding obedience. Holding identity, holding whatever it is that breaks when a man sees the truth and decides silence is safer than speech. I tell you this because it matters for you. You may never step into a physical cellar like that, but you already live inside one of its modern replicas. Social media is a cellar. Surveillance is a cellar. Every time you agree to terms of service you never read, you're walking down the stairs. You are shown too much data, too much information, too many contradictions, and your mind, overwhelmed, does what the inspectors did. It folds, it complies, it accepts the hook. Now you may think, why would anyone design such a thing? Why would institutions, governments, corporations want men broken and compliant? The answer is simple. Control is cheaper than chaos. If the public knew exactly where their money went, exactly what was sealed in their archives, exactly what was fed through their hooks, the system would collapse. So the system keeps you numb. It overwhelms you with noise, blinds you with initials, distracts you with shallow wars and shallow debates. All while the real ledger, the invisible one, marks your obedience with the same word it marked in Lowell, taken. But there's another layer. The Grady brothers' deliveries went to ruins, to burned boarding houses, to addresses struck from the directory. Why? Think like an architect of power. Deliveries to empty places serve 2 purposes. 1, they create plausible deniability. No one receives, no one complains, no trail remains. 2, they symbolize sacrifice. A ruin is a grave of memory. To feed the grave is to consecrate it. To deliver meat to ashes is to acknowledge that what sustains the invisible does not sustain the living. And here's the dangerous part. That ritual never ended. Look at your own time. Look at budgets spent on ghost wars in countries no one can point to on a map. Look at billions allocated to programs that vanish into classified compartments. Look at institutions funneling resources into think tanks whose reports are never read. These are deliveries to ruins, offerings to ghosts. Not of meat, but of money, data, energy, obedience. The ritual repeats, and you play your part whether you choose it or not. But I will not let you remain blind. I will not let you continue as an initial in their ledger. You must see what the inspectors could not say. You must understand what the cellar was, not just a place of horror, but a demonstration of structure. Structure that manipulates memory, identity, obedience. Structure that still operates today. Do you want to know the truth? Here it is. Institutions have always known that men are easier to rule when their perception of reality is fractured. That is why forbidden knowledge is hidden in myth, disguised as superstition, or burned out of the records. That is why the hook is locked away in a glass case, labeled unclaimed. It is not just an artifact, it is evidence. Evidence of how long the ritual has been running, evidence of how much you have been trained not to ask, not to see. Now I need you to breathe, because what I am about to say is not entertainment. It is a weapon you can use, or a poison that can consume you. Once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Ready? The ledger wasn't for customers. It was for initiates. Every initial was a mark of a man who entered the system and surrendered. Every taken was not a transaction of meat. It was a transaction of will. That is why no one remembered buying from the Grady's. They weren't customers. They were sacrifices of another kind. And you right now are being tested in the same way. Not with hooks and sellers, but with algorithms and contracts. Every time you comply without thought, you place your initial in the ledger. Every time you remain silent when you sense something is wrong, you allow the taken mark to be written next to your name. I will ask you directly, are you ready to step out of the ledger? Are you ready to reclaim your name, your identity, your presence? If you are, you must act differently than the inspectors, differently than the citizens of Lowell. They looked, then looked away. You must look and then speak. You must name the cellar when you see it. Call the hook what it is. If not, you will remain another initial in someone else's ritual. Now we move from the map to the architects. The brothers were a pattern. The architects are the invisible hands that studied that pattern and applied it across continents, across institutions. Imagine a web spun not with silk but with contracts, with euphemisms, with polite offices where men in suits and clerical collars speak of efficiency while arranging that which will never be publicly accounted for. They learned from small towns like Lowell how to mask a ritual as commerce, how to make the grotesque resemble the ordinary, and how to turn a hook into an emblem of compliance. These architects do not resemble the caricatures you expect. They are not caped villains or cartoonish conspirators. They are bankers with soft voices, ministers with immaculate collars, civic leaders with clean hands. Their language is antiseptic. Administrative oversight, strategic reserve, classified allotment. Under the surface of that language lies the same grain that held the Grady ledger together. Initials replacing names, permissions replacing proof, a column marked taken that never stops filling. They refine the ritual until it is invisible to those who must feed it. Pay attention to the methods. The first method is institutional layering. In Lowell, the brothers operated openly enough to be plausible. In the modern world, layers of bureaucracy do the same thing, so dense that no single actor can see the whole. A ministry signs a grant to a foundation, the foundation pays a consultant, the consultant hires a shell company, the shell company contracts a closed unit. By the time the resources complete the loop, they are insulated by plausible deniability. The more layers, the longer the paper trail, the less likely anyone will untie the knot. The ledger survives because it is refracted through, or so many hands that it appears as a natural complexity rather than an engineered concealment. The second method is symbolic capture. Symbols are anchors for obedience. You must see what the inspectors could not say. You must understand what the cellar was, not just a place of horror, but a demonstration of structure. Structure that manipulates memory, identity, obedience. Structure that still operates today. Do you want to know the truth? Here it is. Institutions have always known that men are easier to rule when their perception of reality is fractured. That is why forbidden knowledge is hidden in myth, disguised as superstition, or burned out of the records. That is why the hook is locked away in a glass case, labeled unclaimed. It is not just an artifact, it is evidence. Evidence of how long the ritual has been running, evidence of how much you have been trained not to ask, not to see. Now I need you to breathe, because what I am about to say is not entertainment. It is a weapon you can use, or a poison that can consume you. Once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Ready? The ledger wasn't for customers. It was for initiates. Every initial was a mark of a man who entered the system and surrendered. Every taken was not a transaction of meat. It was a transaction of will. That is why no one remembered buying from the Gradys. They weren't customers. They were sacrifices of another kind. And you right now are being tested in the same way. Not with hooks and cellars, but with algorithms and contracts. Every time you comply without thought, you place your initial in the ledger. Every time you remain silent when you sense something is wrong, you allow the taken mark to be written next to your name. I will ask you directly, are you ready to step out of the ledger? Are you ready to reclaim your name, your identity, your presence? If you are, you must act differently than the inspectors, differently than the citizens of Lowell. They looked, then looked away. You must look and then speak. You must name the cellar when you see it. Call the hook what it is. If not, you will remain another initial in someone else's ritual. Now we move from the map to the architects. The brothers were a pattern. The architects are the invisible hands that studied that pattern and applied it across continents, across institutions. Imagine a web spun not with silk but with contracts, with euphemisms, with polite offices where men in suits and clerical collars speak of efficiency while arranging that which will never be publicly accounted for. They learned from small towns like Lowell how to mask a ritual as commerce, how to make the grotesque resemble the ordinary, and how to turn a hook into an emblem of compliance. These architects do not resemble the caricatures you expect. They are not caped villains or cartoonish conspirators. They are bankers with soft voices, ministers with immaculate collars, civic leaders with clean hands. Their language is antiseptic. Administrative oversight, strategic reserve, classified allotment. Under the surface of that language lies the same grain that held the Grady ledger together. Initials replacing names, permissions replacing proof, a column marked taken that never stops filling. They refine the ritual until it is invisible to those who must feed it. Pay attention to the methods. The first method is institutional layering. In Lowell, the brothers operated openly enough to be plausible. In the modern world, layers of bureaucracy do the same thing, so dense that no single actor can see the whole. A ministry signs a grant to a foundation, the foundation pays a consultant, the consultant hires a shell company, the shell company contracts a closed unit. By the time the resources complete the loop, they are insulated by plausible deniability. The more layers, the longer the paper trail, the less likely anyone will untie the knot. The ledger survives because it is refracted through, or so many hands that it appears as a natural complexity rather than an engineered concealment. The second method is symbolic capture. Symbols are anchors for obedience. Courage spreads where fear is habitual because it breaks the assumption that silence is the only safe choice. This is where you, the listener, must decide your posture. Will you be a recorder of details or an accomplice to silence? Will you learn to see layered bureaucracy as a single architecture or accept it as inevitable complexity? The architects depend on your acceptance. They are expert at making complexity look necessary. If you reject that illusion, you can act. You can trace the chain. You can demand that layers be flattened, that symbols be interrogated, that leaks be followed. Courage begins in small acts, asking for receipts, demanding minutes, pressing a clerk until words have meaning. Those actions accumulate. Finally, notice how ancient this dance is. The tools change. Ledgers become databases. Hooks become code. But the game remains. Power always seeks the path that costs the least in resistance. Where people are willing to look away, power will root through. Where people will not, power must either adapt or be exposed. The architects understand adaptation. They refine their methods, layering, symbolism, controlled exposure, cultural engineering. Each is a defensive measure against the single thing that terrifies them most: attention. Hold this. Every time you call a number and are told, "Your call is important to us," remember the ritual. Every time you accept a policy you do not read, remember the ledger. Every time an institution asks for trust without proof, remember the cellar and the bricked corridor. The descent into truth is also a practice in vigilant attention. The architects fear that more than hearings or reports. They fear attention because attention demands evidence. The hook cannot hang in public when light and naming are persistent. There is a moment when secrecy ceases to be abstract and becomes a wound in people's lives. In Lowell, the ledger's cold columns translated into missing meals, quiet beds, children who learn to ask fewer questions. Secrecy is not an idea, it is a material thing that cuts through households, careers, and reputations. It hums in the empty chairs at dinner, in the pauses when names are mentioned, and in the small excuses people make to avoid the ledger. An inspector goes down into the cellar and returns altered. He is not broken by force but by comprehension. He saw a structure the human mind could not comfortably classify. His handwriting trembled, his sentences failed. Families saw the change, felt its ripple. Trauma is not always visible. It appears as avoidance, silence, a reluctance to narrate the truth. In many homes, the rule becomes survival. Do not pry. Do not name. Law becomes the tool institutions use to tidy these wounds. The Grady ledger exploited vanished addresses. Modern systems exploit legal opacity. Non-disclosure agreements, sealed settlements, and classified labels act like mortar over bricked corridors. They make it legally risky to open a door. Where law should restore accountability, it is twisted to become a cloak for omission. When law participates in secrecy, it alters incentives. Rewards for compliance, jobs, protection, prestige become visible, while penalties for curiosity, litigation, exile, career derailment loom. A market forms. Silence is currency. Enforcers of that market can be managers, ministers, union leaders, ordinary people who choose the easy path. The system produces gatekeepers who police tongues and minds. Those gatekeepers are paid in privilege. Memory is the slow theft that secrecy practices. Rituals of remembrance are sabotaged when records are lost or omitted. Families stop telling full stories because parts are painful or implicate the powerful. Towns change maps. Histories are written with blanks. Memory, once fragmented, is hard to restore. The hook in the Lowell Museum is an accusation because it insists someone remember. Repairing memory requires disciplined storytelling, not rumor. Recover names, dates, marginal notes, and small facts. Oral histories, archived letters, photocopied pages, these fragments add up. Assemble many fragments and the ledger's pattern emerges. You cannot defeat an architecture of secrecy with a single headline. You dismantle it with steady archival pressure and networks that do the boring work of cross-checking. The personal work of truth-telling is brutal. Those who step forward face ostracism, legal threats, and slander. The system is designed to make courage costly. Yet courage is contagious. A single testimony that withstands scrutiny can unloose more. Traces accumulate into pressure. Pressure cracks sealed rooms. Light follows. Not every exposure leads to justice. Often revelations produce partial accountability or cosmetic reforms. That is part of the architecture. Controlled exposure. Institutions allow just enough to signal responsiveness without surrendering the ledger. They create commissions, issue redacted reports, and hold scripted hearings. Recognize the theater and demand more. Communities matter. Secrecy flourishes when people are isolated. It dies when people form networks of mutual protection. Build networks that archive and hold each other accountable. Connect journalists with lawyers, historians with technologists, survivors with sympathetic civic leaders. Redundancy matters. If one archive is sealed, another should exist. If one court is compromised, international attention can create pressure. We must reckon with psychological aftermath. Men who see the ledger often carry guilt, not because they are guilty, but because they feel they failed to do more. Survivors internalize responsibility. That is manipulation. The ledger thrives on self-blame. Support systems must exist to reframe responsibility correctly. The fault lies with the architecture, not with those made small by it. Be tactical. Start with small verifiable interventions. Request minutes. File formal complaints and keep parallel records. Use public records laws and freedom of information requests. Report patterns rather than single accusations. Collect anomalies. Misdirected deliveries, payments to shell entities, initials instead of names, and they form a case that is harder to dismiss. Systems built on initials crumble when confronted by linked evidence. Cultivate moral clarity. People will argue about intent and necessity. They will offer excuses about emergencies. Some secrecy may be defensible in rare cases, but most secrecy is routine. The ledger's legitimacy depends on confusion. Clear standards make it harder for institutions to hide behind complexity. Demand that secrecy be justified with evidence, time limits, and oversight. The wound left by the Grady ledger was intimate and generational. Its lessons are operating principles of modern systems. To confront them, combine memory with method, courage with discipline. Tell the story precisely, archive redundantly, and form networks that make isolation impossible. That work is neither glamorous nor swift. It is a grind, but it is where genuine change begins. There is also inherited shame. When a community adapts to secrecy, shame becomes a currency traded. Children learn to lower their eyes at certain names. Schools skip chapters that make authority uncomfortable. Apologies are sometimes offered as theater. A brief statement, a formal phrase, a photo op with a plaque. Those symbolic acts often function as a bandage, preventing real repair. Genuine restitution requires named accountability, not euphemistic statements. So when you consider stepping into this work, prepare for a long haul. Expect harassment and delays. Expect media cycles that tire quickly. Anchor yourself in community. Make redundancy your strategy. Duplicate evidence, record testimony in multiple formats, publish in more than one venue. When institutions shrink from light, pressure from many directions dissolves their alibis. You've now seen how silence wounds families, how law and culture brick over memory. But the descent does not end with private trauma. It spreads outward into entire communities that become immune to their own sickness. Lowell was not unique. What happened there was simply more visible, more grotesque, a local wound that mirrors the anatomy of a global disease. Communities do not need whips or chains to be subdued. They need repetition. The Grady brothers' shop opened at dawn, closed at dusk. Bells rang, sawdust scattered, the smell of brine filled the air. The rhythm itself became a comfort. The people of Lowell came to depend on that predictability, even though they had no reason to. Familiarity breeds legitimacy. Repetition is how the unthinkable becomes ordinary. Ask yourself, what rituals in your own life carry that same weight? The news cycle at 6 and 11, the annual budget announcement, the election every 4 years. These are not neutral markers. They are designed repetitions, civic bells that tell you when to breathe, when to fear, when to look away. The Grady brothers were not selling meat, they were selling rhythm. And rhythm is a narcotic. The most dangerous kind of community infection is normalization. You hear a rumor once and it feels shocking. You hear it 20 times and it becomes background noise. This is how horror is domesticated. The cellar whispers became part of Lowell's air. Don't go down there, mothers told their children. The sentence carried fear, but also resignation. The community encoded caution into folklore and in doing so protected the system rather than dismantling it. This is not history alone. Think of your own folklore. The phrases passed from mouth to mouth. That's just how politics works. You can't fight City Hall. Nothing will ever change. These are not innocent sayings. They are viral mantras, the lullabies of obedience. Every time you repeat them, you tighten the hook in your own mouth. Now let's talk about the guardians of silence, the men who benefit most when a community adapts to horror. In Lowell, they were subtle, the inspectors who closed their books unfinished, the clergy who fell ill rather than denounce, the councilmen who shifted funds but left the brothers untouched. Guardians are never distant overlords. They are neighbors, men who smile in daylight and protect the ledger in twilight. They are rewarded not with public glory, but with quiet survival. Modern guardians wear different uniforms. They are moderators of discourse, editors of memory, custodians of acceptable speech. Their role is the same, to ensure curiosity never catches momentum. They do not have to silence everyone, only enough to create the impression that asking is futile. A man who feels alone in his suspicion will talk himself into silence. Communities reinforce this process through ritualized distraction. In Lowell, festivals and sermons filled the calendar. In your time, entertainment, sports, and endless consumer rituals do the same. Distraction is not always malevolent, but in the hands of guardians it becomes anesthetic. While you debate trivialities, the ledger fills. While you laugh at the circus, the hook swings quietly in the cellar. But here is where the architects make their boldest move. They weaponize shame. In Lowell, a man who spoke too loudly about the brothers risked ridicule. People would whisper, "He's obsessed," or "He's unwell." Shame is the community's immune system, designed to eject those who threaten the narrative. In modern society, the same weapon is wielded more efficiently. Conspiracy theorist, extremist, unstable. Labels become hooks for the mind. Once attached, they drag a man's reputation into the cellar. Understand this: shame is not truth. Shame is management. It is the tool of guardians to keep you docile. The moment you feel that reflex in your gut, the fear of being called mad for asking a real question, you are standing at the edge of the same cellar the inspectors entered. Most retreat, a few descend, and those few, if they survive, become dangerous in a way the system fears. Now I will ask something of you. If you've stayed with me this far, you've already crossed a threshold. You've seen the hook, the ledger, the guardians, the rituals. You are no longer an initial in someone else's column. To seal that transformation, I want you to act. Write the phrase, "I will not be taken," in the comments below. Write it twice. Once for the self you were before this story, once for the self you are becoming. This is not algorithmic engagement. This is a symbolic act, a declaration. You are speaking back to the ledger. You are refusing the hook. This is the point where the descent stops being historical and becomes surgical. I'm about to show you how power moves from the outside in, how institutions stop merely taking resources and begin to harvest identity. Listen like a man who knows his face might change after hearing the truth. This is not poetic exaggeration, it is method. The ledger, you will discover, learns to write on flesh. Begin with a simple observation. Names are the first lines of defense. A name is more than a label, it is a container for memory. A ledger entry you can hold in your hand and speak aloud. Take a name away or compress it into an initial and you make a man negotiable. That is what the Grady ledger did. It reduced whole persons to single letters that could be crossed off without a funeral, without a notice, without a reckoning. The first move toward harvesting identity is depersonalization, the erosion of linguistic dignity. But there is a second move, quieter and more effective: narrative replacement. Once you have replaced somebody's name with a code, you replace their story with a story that suits the system. In Lowell, that story became silence, rumor, and forgetfulness. In modern systems, the story is more sophisticated. It's a psychological profile, a dossier of weaknesses, a curated biography that fits the needs of power. Institutions do not merely seek to erase, they seek to re-author. They compose a version of you that can be negotiated, threatened, and traded. This re-authoring is the central crime against personhood. You must understand how methodical this is. The system learns patterns. What gets a man defensive? What makes him apologize? What makes him relent? It uses those patterns to craft interventions, a targeted rumor, a strategic job offer, a publicized failure. These interventions are not random. They are tests and calibrations. The ledger records not only compliance, but susceptibility. Over time, the system builds a profile so accurate it can predict when a man will fold. That predictive model is the most dangerous kind of ledger because it turns identity into a resource to be harvested on a schedule. Now consider initiation. The inspectors of Lowell who went down into the cellar did not return with full testimony. They came back with altered selves. That alteration was an initiation into a new frame of reality, one where secrecy was inevitable, where silence was sensible, where complicity became a shield. Modern initiations are subtler but no less effective. An offer of membership in a professional clique, an invitation to exclusive gatherings, a seat at a committee. These are initiation rites that convert curiosity into complicity. They replace the man's prior loyalties with institutional loyalty. The ledger gains another account, not just what you do, but who you become. Identity harvesting is also psychological extortion. Once the system has a map of your fears and your desires, it can make demands that feel personal and unavoidable. Betray a friend or lose a career, sign an agreement or have your family's benefits removed, stay silent or watch a spouse's reputation be altered. These choices are not choices the way we think of them. They are transactions on the ledger where identity itself is the currency. The system does not have to force you. It simply offers trade-offs that the average man will rationalize to survive. The result is a population of people who have traded pieces of themselves for comfort, safety, or status. Listen to me carefully. This is why shame is so effective. Shame is not merely a social emotion, it is a governance technology. When you feel ashamed, you police yourself. You rewrite your behavior to avoid the sharp edge of public scorn. The ledger weaponizes shame by pointing to the narrative replacements it has authored and saying, "See, he is flawed, do not stand with him." Once the community aligns around that shame, the individual's resistance collapses without the institution ever needing to raise a hand. There is also a generational dimension. Identity harvesting is not a single act, but a cumulative program. Children absorb the censored versions of ancestors. Schools teach sanitized histories. Libraries omit certain names. Over time, entire family trees are pruned. A man discovers his grandfather was missing or gone, and the story offered is thin and polite. Over generations, the ledger rewrites the past so thoroughly that people cannot remember the original contours of their lives. This is how institutions sterilize memory and plant their own seeds in its place. What does the harvest look like on the ground? Broken relationships, careers halted, reputations hollowed out. Men who once spoke freely now ration words. They learn to perform loyalty with the right phrases, to keep certain topics off the table. They build invisible fences around themselves. The ledger does not need to mark them daily once they have internalized its demands. They become self-regulating entries in the system's book, maintaining the architecture without visible coercion. Now hear this. Identity can be reclaimed, but reclamation is surgical work and moral labor combined. The first step is naming. When you stop being an initial and insist on your name, you interrupt the ledger's shorthand. Pronounce your history aloud. Tell the anecdotes your family never told. Write the names that were erased into the public record. Naming is a small, defiant act because it refuses the contract the ledger offered, anonymity in exchange for peace. Second, resist narrative replacement by telling your own story with relentless specificity. Institutions prefer generalities because generalities are unprovable. Specifics are dangerous to them. Speak dates, places, the names of witnesses, publish documents. Insist on detail. The ledger cannot easily refute a well-catalogued life. When you produce evidence, you force the system to match narrate. And matching requires labor and exposure. Third, build counter-rituals. If the institution uses initiation rites to absorb you, create rites of separation. Publicly celebrate those who refused to sell pieces of themselves. Create gatherings where naming is honored, where obscured histories are read aloud. Make refusal visible and desirable. Rituals create templates for behavior. If the institutional ritual is to silence, your counter-ritual must make speech a social advantage. Fourth, cultivate allies who will not rewrite your story for convenience. The ledger profits from isolation. A single ally can give you the courage to act. A network protects you from being reauthored. Lawyers, journalists, historians, and friends who keep records are not mere accessories. They are instruments of resistance. And finally, accept that reclamation is costly. The ledger will respond. Expect smear campaigns, threats, legal pressure. Expect friends to falter. The harvesters are skilled at retaliation. But also understand this. The ledger grows because men calculate that the personal cost of resistance is too high. When enough men decide the cost is acceptable, the ledger collapses under the weight of cumulative refusals. I tell you this not to frighten you, but to arm you. Identity harvesting is not myth. It is a method with a predictable logic. When you learn the logic, you can counter it. When you insist on naming, when you refuse the initial, when you tell the specifics, you become a contagion of clarity. The more men who refuse to be reduced, the less effective the system becomes. We have crossed the threshold where men are no longer merely entries in the ledger, but resources harvested and reshaped. Now comes the most bitter revelation. Those who are taken are not always discarded. Many are repurposed. Institutions rarely waste material. They bend it, mold it, and redeploy it as an instrument of control. This is how victims become administrators, how silence is not only guarded but preached. Think again of Lowell. Inspectors descended into the cellar and came back alte, red. They did not resign in disgust. They did not rally the town. They returned to their offices, signed their names on half-empty reports, and enforced the very silence that broke them. Their trauma was weaponized. The ledger did not just record their fear. It used it. Once a man has seen what he cannot explain, he becomes a perfect gatekeeper. He knows enough to fear, but not enough to act. He becomes a warning to others. Look what happens if you look too far. This is the pivot of institutional design, transformation of the wounded into the warden. Those who glimpse the ledger's truth are given subtle choices, ruin or reintegration as a functionary. Most men, cornered by their own terror, choose reintegration. They become the most loyal servants because they carry inside them both knowledge of what lies beneath and terror of revisiting it. Fear is the leash. In modern systems, this process is dressed in softer clothes. Whistleblowers are quietly absorbed into committees. Critics are offered jobs that neutralize their dissent. Soldiers who break under the weight of war are given medals and folded into veteran networks where questioning the mission is taboo. Trauma becomes the seal of credibility, and credibility becomes a leash. The system points to them and says, "See, he has seen everything, and he still serves. Trust him." The repurposed man becomes both shield and mouthpiece. But there is a deeper corruption at work, moral inversion. Imagine a man who once believed he was protecting his community. He discovers that the institution he serves feeds on silence, yet instead of leaving, he justifies his presence with new logic. If I stay, I can limit the damage. Over time, he begins to enforce the rules he once hated, rationalizing that enforcement keeps chaos at bay. The victim becomes an advocate. His conscience is inverted. He begins to speak the language of his capt. He becomes a voluntary extension of the ledger. This cycle has no shortage of examples. Inquisitors who once feared the fire, now setting it. Officers who were brutalized in training, brutalizing recruits in turn. Executives who swore they would never betray their workers, now signing contracts that bind them. The ledger's brilliance is not only in consuming men, but in teaching them to consume others. What began as survival mutates into complicity, and complicity becomes career. But perhaps the darkest element is this. Once repurposed, these men become indistinguishable from true believers. You cannot tell which gatekeepers are conscious actors and which are coerced. This ambiguity paralyzes resistance. If every authority might be victim or villain, suspicion fractures the community. Trust dissolves. Neighbors eye each other warily, and the ledger thrives because division is as nourishing as silence. You must ask yourself, how do you avoid becoming one of these repurposed? The first answer is vigilance over your own bargains. When the system offers you comfort in exchange for silence, you must name the offer for what it is, a purchase order for your soul. The second answer is accountability to others who know your story. If you stand alone, the ledger can twist you. If you are bound to men who will not let you rewrite your own history, you are harder to bend. Understand, refusal is costly. Some who resist will be ruined, some will be broken. But the ledger cannot repurpose what it cannot capture. The man who walks away may suffer exile, but his conscience remains unbent. That man is rare, but he is dangerous in a way no functionary can be, because he can still tell the truth without inversion, without leash. Yet here is the terrible irony. Those rare men are often erased from the record. Institutions will not allow their stories to stand. So if you ever meet one, if you hear a testimony uncorrupted, guard it like fire, share it, archive it, repeat it until it cannot be killed. For in a world of repurposed servants, the voice of one unbroken man is more destabilizing than 1,000 signatures on a petition. And now we must stare into the blackest corridor yet. If victims become administrators, what then of the culture they enforce? What rituals, what performances, what illusions are crafted to ensure the next generation does not even recognize the cellar? That is the final descent, when secrecy no longer requires enforcement because the community itself has been programmed to love its own erasure. You've seen how men are harvested, broken, and remade into instruments of silence. But there is a stage beyond the individual, a corruption that seeps into the collective bloodstream. This is when secrecy no longer needs constant enforcement because obedience has been woven into culture itself. The ledger becomes invisible, yet omnipresent, encoded into ritual, custom, and myth. Look again at Lowell. The brothers' shop wasn't guarded by soldiers or barred gates. It was guarded by routine. Bells rang, sawdust was swept, meat hooks swung. That rhythm was enough to anesthetize suspicion. The cellar was hidden not by chains, but by familiarity. Over time, the people of Lowell stopped asking questions not because they were forbidden, but because asking seemed absurd. Why question what has always been there? This is the most dangerous phase of control. Normalization. Once horror is normalized, it no longer requires defense. It becomes tradition. Communities can endure almost anything so long as it arrives wrapped in ritual. Festivals, church sermons, civic parades, these were the distractions that softened Lowell's unease. Today, the distractions are sharper, more relentless. Screens, celebrity scandals, political theater, games and streaming spectacles, rituals of attention designed to keep you fed on noise while the ledger writes its quiet lines. And here lies the cunning twist. These rituals are not merely distractions, they are inoculations. By offering you controlled doses of scandal, fear, and outrage, the system convinces you that you've seen everything. You binge crime dramas thinking you understand corruption. You read headlines of political disgrace believing you've glimpsed power's darkest corners. But what you are given is theater, diluted truth packaged as entertainment. It keeps you satisfied enough not to seek the cellar itself. Think of myths, too. Every culture has them. In Lowell, it was whispers of haunted houses, ghostly mills, superstitions that explained away what should have been investigated. In modern society, the myths are industrial. Progress is inevitable. Leaders always know best. Technology will save us. These myths operate like lullabies. They soothe doubt. They give you stories that keep you in bed instead of marching to the cellar door. And the most perverse myth of all, the system is too big to fight. This is the myth that guarantees survival for the ledger. It tells you that even if you see the pattern, even if you feel the hook brushing your skin, there is no use resisting. The myth becomes self-fulfilling. Men lower their eyes. They trade questions for distractions. They rehearse the phrases of resignation. That's just life. It's always been this way. Nothing ever changes. These are not reflections of truth. They are instructions planted in your mouth. Do you see it yet? You are not simply living inside history. You are living inside an engineered story, one designed to keep you docile. Culture itself has been bent into a machine of compliance. Every joke that trivializes power, every advertisement that sells you comfort as freedom, every anthem that demands tears without scrutiny. These are engineered notes in a symphony of sedation. The ledger is not just written in ink. It is written in song, in ceremony, in screens that bathe you in light until your suspicion dims. And perhaps you feel it now. The unease, the sense that the very air around you is scripted. That unease is correct. It is the faint resistance of your mind remembering it was not always this way. Hold on to that, because once culture is captured, escape requires deliberate rupture. You cannot drift your way free. You must learn to interrogate the rituals themselves. Why do we repeat what we repeat? Who benefits from the myths we tell? What is hidden behind the entertainments we consume? But here is the cruelest revelation. Most men do not want to be free of the culture. They cling to the myths because the myths are warm. They prefer distraction because clarity is cold. To see the ledger is to live with discomfort. And so they choose sedation, year after year, generation after generation. This is why institutions no longer fear resistance. They know most men will fight to defend the very rituals that bind them. You are not most men. You would not have followed me this far if you were. That means the burden falls heavier on you than on others. To awaken in a culture engineered for sleep is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. To question the rituals is to risk exile, mockery, and shame. But it is also the only way to break the cycle. When one man refuses the myths, he becomes a mirror for others. He cracks the illusion. He makes visible what was invisible. Now we approach the last corridor. We have moved from family wounds to law, to identity, to culture. There remains only the deepest question. What happens when even memory itself is rewritten? When history is erased, rearranged, or falsified so completely that truth becomes impossible to reconstruct? That is where we descend next, into the death of memory, into the final silence the ledger longs for. This is the final corridor, and it is the darkest. We've spoken of wounds in families, of law's mortar, of harvested identities and cultural anesthesia. But all of it points here, to the erasure of memory itself, because the ledger's ultimate aim is not secrecy, it is amnesia. If silence protects institutions for a season, amnesia protects them forever. Consider the hook in Lowell's museum. A solitary artifact locked in glass, divorced from context. A relic without narrative. Most who glance at it feel nothing. They don't know what it carried, what screams it silenced. The ledger won. It reduced a whole story to an object without teeth. That is what the death of memory looks like. Evidence stripped of its voice. This is why regimes burn books, why conquerors rewrite maps, why archives vanish in accidental fires. It is why every oppressive system eventually develops its own historians. They don't erase truth directly, they bury it under layers of interpretation until the lie is easier to accept than the work of excavation. Amnesia is not forgetting by accident. It is forgetting by design. And here is the terrible power of amnesia. Once memory is gone, even outrage loses its target. You cannot grieve what you cannot name. You cannot have what you cannot recall. The ledger knows this. That is why its final project is not fear or obedience, but the sterilization of history itself. Men without memory cannot resist. They cannot even imagine what has been lost. But let me tell you something more dangerous, something that should chill you deeper than the cellar of Lowell. You are living inside an era of engineered forgetting right now. Information floods you daily, faster than any generation before. But abundance is its own form of erasure. Truth drowns in noise. Every hour, a new scandal, a new headline, a new distraction. Who can remember last week's revelation when today's outrage is brighter? Memory is not destroyed by fire alone. It is destroyed by overload. And still, there are subtler forms, algorithms that decide which fragments of history you see and which vanish. Digital censorship buried not under red ink but under invisibility. Historical revisions taught as unquestionable curriculum. Films, series, even jokes that reshape collective recollection. Every man walking today carries memories that are not his own, crafted for him, fed to him. He thinks he remembers, but he remembers a narrative planted like a seed. Now ask yourself, what will survive of you when the ledger has finished its work? Will your name become an initial? Will your story be smoothed into something convenient? Will your children inherit only fragments, half-phrases, sanitized legends? That is the real theft. Not only your life, but your afterlife in memory. Erased, rearranged, forgotten. But here, in this final descent, I will give you the key that breaks the spell. Memory is a weapon, if you learn to wield it deliberately. The first act of resistance is record. Keep journals, archive names, photograph documents, speak stories aloud, build networks of memory outside sanctioned systems. One man with a ledger of his own, truthful, detailed, unflinching, is a threat to the architecture of amnesia. The second act is repetition. Tell the stories until they cannot be buried. Speak the forbidden aloud in gatherings. Write it where others will find it. Hand it to your children. Power survives not just by destroying truth, but by convincing you it isn't worth repeating. Defy that. Make memory relentless. And the third act is defiance in how you live. When you refuse to become an initial, when you insist on naming your history, when you preserve memory despite cost, you deny the ledger its final victory. You may not topple the institution in your lifetime, but you ensure it cannot erase you completely, and that, brother, is enough to poison the machine. The Grady brothers are gone, the cellar is bricked, the ledger sits silent in a forgotten archive, but the architecture that fed them still thrives. It thrives wherever memory is weak, wherever men choose sedation over clarity, wherever truth is left to rot. Do not make that choice. Remember, speak, archive, resist, because once you see the hook, once you smell the cellar, once you glimpse how far the ledger extends, you are no longer innocent. You are changed. And what you do with that change will decide whether you remain a spectator of shadows or whether you become one of the few who pulls others toward the light. So now I leave you with this charge: guard memory like fire. For when memory dies, men become cattle. But when memory burns, even the thickest darkness cannot stand forever. The descent is complete. The question is not whether the ledger exists. The question is whether you will let it write your name.